I dropped out of high school in 1982, at the age of 17. I promptly left my parents' house and fell in with the wrong crowd. For a while, to sustain myself, I knocked over houses. I kept it simple. B&E, small neighborhoods mostly. Smash and grab jobs. I'd wait until the Beamer left the garage, go in, get the loot, get out. One problem with those jobs was the payout. It was feast or famine, and more often than not, it was the latter. The risk of incarceration was ever present, of course, and after narrowly escaping the long arm a couple times, I started feeling untouchable. I thought I was hot shit. Then along came the old lady. It was the summer of 1989. Batman with Michael Keaton had just hit the theaters and everybody was talking about it. I was more of an Indiana Jones fan myself. I kept my ear to the tracks, always on the lookout for jobs. An old woman showed up one night in July looking for help. She was looking for a cat burglar. I fit the description, I guess. She just appeared from the darkness of the street, so I listened to her. She asked me to break into a house. Inside it was a lockbox. Inside the box was something very important, she said. She wanted me to retrieve the contents and bring them to her. Simple, right? Just one thing. She wouldn't tell me where the box was located or what was contained within. Also, she punctuated her offer with this simple statement. Look out for the flat man. What the hell was that supposed to mean? Was he the landlord? She wouldn't go into detail. The warning had me feeling apprehensive, but a job's a job, and I needed money bad. One thing I knew for sure, she was afraid of that house. To be fair, she was old enough to be my grandmother. Maybe she had dementia. Needless to say, I took the job. A week later, I found myself at the ass end of town, in a small residential area near the industrial district. It was hot as hell outside. This was the last street of homes before it was factories for miles. The house was situated at the end of the road in a small cul-de-sac. On the other side of the property was a sprawling rail yard. I spent a night or two casing the place, and it didn't take long to see that it was abandoned. The other houses on that street might as well have been too. The curb was lined with rusted-out junkers, and stray cats sauntered along the fence lines. The street was a shithole. I barely saw a soul most of the time I was there. I probably could have waltzed into that house in broad daylight, and nobody would have noticed or cared. It was the biggest building on the street, and clearly the oldest. 3 stories and worse for wear. It was an older, Queen Anne-style Victorian home, with a steep roof and a spire poking up above the treetops. It looked like it had once been painted blue or turquoise, but most of that color had been lost to the years. All the glass was broken or cracked, save for one tiny round window at the attic level. The front porch was sagging in spots, and the awning above drooped down, threatening to collapse. The yard, if you could call it that, was just gray dirt dotted with paltry scrub. Broken tiles and pieces of wood and shit were all over the place. I patiently watched for my dented Subaru DL wagon, parked a few houses down. Smoked some cigs with my seat back, listened to the ghost-like moans of train horns in the distance. Paula Abdul serenaded me from the radio, in between ads for McDonald's pizza. Yeah, at the time that was a thing. And this new thing called the Sega Genesis. From time to time I would open a tiny box. Oh, right, the box. Forgot to mention that. As if this job wasn't strange enough. It was a handcrafted wooden box, a little smaller than a pack of cigarettes. The old lady had given it to me the night I agreed to do the job. Said I would need it. The inside was lined with blue velvet, and it contained a small gem. The gem was pretty enough, pigeon's blood red with facets cut into a teardrop shape. It was about the size of my thumbnail. It interested me as much as it perplexed me. After casing the house for 2 nights, it was time to make my move. On the 3rd night, I silently made my way up to the house. It felt bigger up close. The front door was boarded up, so I cut through the yard to the side and into the backyard. Above, the moon hid behind clumps of clouds. Not a sound. I climbed the 4 steps to the back door. Quick check of my digital watch showed 12:46 a.m. Inside was some kind of mudroom with dusty shelves along one wall. Nearby was a cracked ceramic sink and a stack of old steel buckets. There was a heavy-looking wooden door at the end of the room. Next was a sizable kitchen. Save for a heavy layer of dust on everything, the place seemed much tidier than it had any business being. A heavy silence hung in the house. Despite the broken windows, it was quiet as a tomb in there. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. I started searching around for the lockbox. The beam of my flashlight struck the stained wooden cabinetry and marble countertops. The floor was covered in dark green tiles, and there were still pots and pans and dishes in the cupboards. The house seemed decently preserved. After the kitchen was the dining room. Dust and cobwebs blanketed the room, and there was a stale smell all around. The ceilings were tall, and from them hung 2 expensive-looking chandeliers. My gaze fell on a gigantic table covered in a flowered tablecloth. I then entered a small hallway which led to a large main hall. Here I could see a wide staircase which led to an upper landing. The stairs took a right turn along the back wall and continued up and out of sight to the 3rd floor above. The walls here were wine-colored. As I passed, I gawked at the bizarre paintings covering the walls. A horse with wild eyes, ridden by a man in Victorian clothing. A baby with an unusually wrinkled face. A woman with a vengeful expression, baring her teeth. The paintings may have been worth something, but I couldn't bring myself to touch the grotesque art pieces. I was about to make my way upstairs when I heard a sound. It was barely audible. Then it got louder. Tiny clicking and tapping noises. Rain. But what? Rain? It was 80 degrees and cloudless when I'd entered the house. I listened as the rain's intensity increased until it was pouring. Raindrops rattled the roof far above and dribbled through the broken windows. I could smell petrichor wafting through the cracks in the glass. I made my way upstairs and found the master bedroom at the end of a long hallway, spangled with more freaky paintings. The door was wide open, and inside was a weathered bed frame heaped with comforters and pillows. The room smelled like mildew. Water dripped from the high ceiling to form a pool on the hardwood floor. I shone the flashlight around, searching for a lockbox. I checked the huge walk-in closet, and then under the bed, and then behind the heavy wardrobe in the corner of the room. Suddenly, there was a flash of lightning, which lit the room for a brief second. I realized 2 things at that moment. One, that the entire ceiling here was made of glass skylights, and 2, the wall behind the bed was dominated by a massive painting, at least 10 feet tall and just as wide. It was once a huge portrait of someone, apparently, but it had been altered. It was as if someone took buckets of black paint and splashed it over the entire face. Now the face was black and smeared, featureless. Something about it seemed malicious, hateful even. Just then, a snarl of thunder crackled through the house, shaking the windows in their frames. Wind whipped sheets of rain into the windows and skylights. I realized I was shaking. I wasn't cold, but the house was just so unnerving I couldn't help it. So I moved on, back into the hallway. Just then, I heard a voice downstairs that made me stop in my tracks and strain to listen. It had to be coming from the dining room/kitchen area. It was a soft voice, but echoed in the large main hall nonetheless. It was a man's voice, talking constantly as if carrying on a conversation. I was frozen in place, listening carefully. As it got closer, to my horror, I realized the voice was speaking in absolute gibberish. It was like someone talking in their sleep. None of it made any sense. Something about the way the words slurred together chilled my blood. And then, 20 feet away at the end of the hall, a silhouette came into view. It was the shape of a person, but flat. Flat as in two-dimensional, like someone's shadow. It stood stationary now, arms down at its sides. I couldn't move. The figure didn't budge either. The weird, unintelligible words came spilling out of it, filling my ears. Just then, another peal of thunder tore through the house. I took a step backward and immediately tripped, falling onto my back. My eyes darted to the end of the hallway, but the flat man was gone. Somehow, I pulled myself to my feet quickly and headed towards the main hall. I moved from room to room, desperately looking for the lockbox. Each room had a different feel to it. Some of them were furnished as if frozen in time. Others contained boxes stacked to the ceiling. Another room was filled with mannequins dressed in various outfits while a beat-up old sewing machine sat against the back wall. One thing was for sure. There was no lockbox anywhere. Finally, I headed up the steep staircase to the highest floor. I was met by a narrow, wood-paneled hallway with 2 doors on each side. The end of the hall was punctuated by a 5th door, half the height and width of the others. Before I could try any of the doors, I heard the voice of the flat man again downstairs somewhere. Nonsensical babble echoed through the main hall. I moved as quietly as possible, trying the first room on the left. Here was a simple bed, and next to it a desk covered with a stack of yellowed papers. I checked the other rooms. Same deal. Nothing special, just a bed and a desk. I went back and checked out the miniature door. It was covered in intricate carvings. Birds, goats, horses, wolves, fish, lizards, foxes, all kinds of animals. I tried the tiny doorknob with a trembling hand. Locked. Of fucking course, I whispered to myself. My first instinct was to try to pry the door open, or kick it out of the frame, but I didn't want him to hear me. I did not want that thing climbing the stairs, that shadow shape. I could still hear the strangely calm voice, muffled through the floor, moving from room to room downstairs. I took a knee and checked out the doorknob in the light of my flashlight. My breath came out shaky and frantic. Maybe I could pick the lock. It was made of brass, or maybe gold, and etched with leaves and flowers in an impressive pattern. In the center was a teardrop-shaped indentation. I took my fingertip and gently felt along the edge of the shape. Then it hit me. I produced the small, blood-colored gem. Carefully, I pressed the faceted stone into the indentation on the doorknob. It fit perfectly. Something inside the door clicked gently. I tried the knob again, and it turned smoothly. It was a key, after all. I opened the door, tiny, as if it was made for a toddler. It wasn't a room at all on the other side, but a small closet. The walls were patterned with purple flowers. On the hardwood floor was a crystal bowl, and within that a strange, single silver coin. I scooped up the coin to examine it closer. It was like no currency I've ever seen. On the one side was a bird surrounded with holly leaves, and on the other, a galleon adorned in billowing sails. Pocketing the coin, I silently made my way back to the top of the 3rd floor staircase. Now the unintelligible voice downstairs was gone. I decided not to wait and headed down to the 1st floor as quietly as possible. Unfortunately, each step was answered with angry creaks and groans from the ancient floorboards underneath me. I headed to the only door in the house I hadn't opened yet. A narrow door underneath the stairs. The hinges squealed loudly in protest as I opened it up. I stepped in to find the top of a staircase leading down to the basement. I took a few deep breaths. I descended the rickety basement stairs. The basement was cold, damp, and quiet. It took me a moment to realize what I was looking at, but it sank in when I pointed my flashlight at the wall. Skulls. Human skulls. It was as if the wall was built out of them. And it wasn't just skulls. It was femurs, tibia, vertebrae. The entire basement was adorned in human bones. I nearly dropped my flashlight as I retched. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then, finally, I found it. There was a heavy-looking iron lockbox in the farthest corner of the basement, sitting on a wooden table. Thunder growled outside. I'd been planning all this time to carry the lockbox out of the house where I could open it later on my own time. I had not anticipated it being so sturdy. It was big, and looked as if it weighed 100 pounds, maybe more. I approached and examined the mechanism. The lockbox was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The entire unit was covered in ornate designs. It was made to look as if metal vines had taken over the outside, twisting and intertwining delicately. The whole thing was beautiful, and I'm sure it was worth a fortune in itself, but I could give a fuck less at this point. I wanted the contents, and then I wanted out of there. I ran my fingers over the front of the lockbox. There were no dials, levers, or keyholes. There was, however, a plaque on the front, on which the following expression was etched: Ego non relinquum vos. There was a thin slot underneath the plaque. My mind raced as I remembered the coin I had found earlier. It was a long shot, but this whole job was fucked up enough that it made sense in its own bizarre way. I pulled out the coin. My hands were shaking so hard I nearly dropped it to the floor. I sank the coin into the slot on the front of the lockbox, and it fell into the mechanism with a clunk. There was a sudden silence. Even the rain outside finally seemed to subside. Somewhere inside the lockbox, I could hear gentle clicks and clockwork moving. Then the ornate lid popped open. My heart slamming in my chest, I grabbed the door and opened it completely. There, sitting at the bottom of the lockbox, was a tiny, black velvet pouch, and nothing else. I snatched it hastily and shoved it into my pocket. I didn't walk or jog. I ran the fuck out of the basement, to the main hall, then to the mudroom in the back. As I entered the mudroom, I realized that the rain had stopped completely. As I stood there listening for the rain, a new sound came. The sound of whispers. I spun on my heels and found myself facing the flat man. The shadow stood directly in front of me now, whispering accursed nonsense like some twisted serenade. I pulled my arm back to swing at him, but as I raised my flashlight, pain exploded in my chest. I looked down to see a shining length of steel stuck deep into my ribs. My muscles tightened around the blade. Adrenaline dumped into my system. I pushed hard into the figure, but it was as if there was nobody there. I pitched forward, but managed to catch myself on the countertop in the next room. Dime-sized drops of blood pattered to the floor. The flat man and the blade were mysteriously gone. I grabbed my side, looking for something to help stop the bleeding. I found a dusty hand towel and clutched it to my side. Pain fired through my chest and arms. I stopped abruptly as the strange voice returned, just out of view in the main hall. More nonsense. I forced myself up and out of the kitchen, and out of the mudroom. I pushed my way out of the back door to the warm evening air. It made no sense. The ground was dry. It was the same 80-degree summer night. I didn't question it. So much weird shit had happened, I just wanted to leave and never come back to that dead-end street again. I made it to my car and climbed in. I looked at my shirt, which was now wet with dark blood. When I was sure it was safe, I opened the black velvet bag and poured the contents into my hand. Contained within was a heavy gold comb. Engraved on the side in fancy script was the name, Lucy. I checked my watch. 1 a.m. Had I really been inside that house only 14 minutes? This made even less sense. I gave up trying to make sense of it and drove away. The next night, she insisted on meeting at night, and the old lady returned. She accepted the black velvet pouch, then thanked me profusely. Her gnarled old hands clutched at the bag tightly. It occurred to me that she was wearing the same clothes that she was wearing the night I accepted the job. Her gaze landed on the bandages wrapped around my chest. Her expression looked solemn and her eyes glistened, as if she would begin to cry. But she said nothing. Without a word, she handed me a crisp envelope with a single shaky hand. It was stuffed full of 20s. There was no conversation. I didn't ask her about the flat man or about the catacombs or how she was related to that house. I really had no interest in learning more, nor to have any further dealings with the strange old lady. She took the black velvet bag and walked off into the darkness of the street. I never saw her again. I still have nightmares, even now, about the flat man standing there at the end of the hallway, waiting for me to make my move, and then the blade stuck in deep. Every time, when I wake up, my chest hurts. The pain has never really gone away. And I swear, I can smell the petrichor on the air. Just for a moment.